Snoop, Doggy Dogg, and Dr. Dre are doing an album together in 2024? What does this even mean? So reportedly, they've been working on this new album since 2022. This will be the first Snoop Dogg album since Doggystyle, his 1993 debut, that's going to be entirely produced by Dr. Dre. This album is called Missionary because, you know, Doggystyle, Missionary. Well, it's so nostalgic in certain ways, but there's the symbolism in what this represents, that Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre are collaborating on this album. And then there's the eventual reality. Once the album is released, it's a question of what we actually get in the album. So again, the album is called Missionary. This is going to be released on Death Row, which Snoop just bought in 2022, I believe. So Snoop is now the owner of Death Row. I mean, you want to talk about coming full circle. So it's going to be Death Row and Aftermath Interscope. Now, for one of the most iconic duos, which Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre are among the most iconic duos in rap history, if not the most iconic. I mean, even when you just say those words together, Snoop, Doggy Dogg, and Dr. Dre, you harken back to 1992. But for a duo that has the reputation of Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, they didn't do a ton of work together. I mean, Snoop made his debut on the Deep Cover soundtrack. So it was Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg with the song 187 on the mother in cop. And this was shortly after Dr. Dre left NWA, went to Death Row, and eventually released The Chronic. Now, Snoop Dogg's on almost the whole Chronic. He's on more than half of the songs on that album. He's kind of the featured voice, although Dre was doing a lot of rapping, as Dre also did on his second album, Dr. Dre 2001. A lot of people call it the Chronic 2, Chronic 2000. He was gonna name it that, but because Death Row kind of blocked his usage in the word chronic, and they ended up releasing kind of like a album at the same time, a compilation called the Chronic 2 or the Chronic 2000. Dr. Dre eventually just renamed the album Dr. Dre 2001. Total hater move by Death Row at that time, but Dr. Dre released the iconic Chronic. Snoop Dogg was on more than half of that album, and then in '93, Snoop Dogg, then called Snoop Doggy Dogg, releases Doggystyle. Dr. Dre produces that whole thing. Now, Daz was also a producer who was coming up and ended up producing a lot of, you know, like the Dog Pound's dog food album, but Dr. Dre produced Doggystyle, so there's that, and that is still Snoop Dogg's greatest album, like by far. So at this point, you've got Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre mostly having worked on Deep Cover, The Chronic, where Snoop is featured on most of it, and then Doggystyle. Now, beyond that point, Dr. Dre, you know, releases Keep Their Heads Ringing in 1995. That's that very good, you know, solo single from the Friday soundtrack. Death Row releases Murder Was the Case soundtrack in '94. And remember, around this time, Snoop Dogg is actually battling a murder trial. So he didn't have the most active '94. He's featured on a lot of the songs on Murder Was the Case. He was featured on that Above the Rim soundtrack that also launched Warren G's Regulate, which was later featured later that year on Regulate G-Funk Era, Warren G's debut. But Snoop Dogg was mostly battling that in '94 and '95. By the time he reemerges with his second album, Dr. Dre has already left Death Row. So Snoop Dogg releases The Dogfather. This is around the same time, you know, Tupac got killed. It was shortly after that. Tupac releases Machiavelli. Snoop Dogg releases The Dogfather. And on The Dogfather, one of the reasons why there was such a lower enthusiasm for the album, not that the album's a bad album, but Dr. Dre doesn't produce one song on that album. So it's almost like Snoop is trying to get the bearings of his career back on track. Because again, he had that little '94, '95 hiatus. Not that his name fell out of the limelight or anything. And he was featured on some great songs like Two of America's Most Wanted. He was on some key tracks from Dog Food. But The Dogfather doesn't have any Dr. Dre produced work. And if you remember, around that same time, Dr. Dre's trying to get his own label, Aftermath, off the ground. He had that Aftermath compilation with Been There, Done That, right? So Dr. Dre, this is before 2001. This is before he signs Eminem and kind of reinvents his production around Eminem's work. So Snoop releases The Dogfather. Dr. Dre releases that Aftermath compilation. Then shortly after that, Snoop leaves Death Row for No Limit Records. This was kind of a new beginning for Snoop Dogg. So he releases 3 albums on the then red hot No Limit Records, Master P's label, where they released albums from True, Mia X, eventually Mystical, the brothers Silk the Shocker and C Murder, the other 2 members of True, along with Master P, Mr. Servon. They had like a whole roster of rappers, and they got popping a couple years before Cash Money got popping. So Snoop Dogg signs with Master P's No Limit. They release 3 albums together: The Game Is To Be Sold, Not To Be Told, No Limit Top Dog, and The Last Meal. And if I'm to do a quick review, like a 1-minute review on these 3 albums, the best way I could sum it up is these albums become increasingly West Coast. You start with The Game Is To Be Sold, where it doesn't even sound like a Snoop Dogg album. It sounds like a No Limit album featuring Snoop Dogg, and that's mostly because of the production. You had Beats by the Pound, KLC, Odell, Craig B, the Beats by the Pound producers doing most of the production. Beats by the Pound was the in-house No Limit production team, so they produced most of those songs. I mean, you had a couple from Meech Wells and DJ Pooh and Superfly. And by the way, that Dogfather album, Snoop's last Death Row album, the production was mostly either DJ Pooh, Daz, or Superfly. That was mostly who was holding down the production on that album. So on The Game Is To Be Sold, again, it's mostly Beats by the Pound with a couple, West Coast producers. Then you get to No Limit Top Dog. You have much more production from West Coast producers, a lot of Meech Wells, a few songs from DJ Quick, Jelly Roll, a track by Ant Banks, the Bay Area producer from the early 90s. Well, you also got a few songs finally produced by Dr. Dre. So Dr. Dre's just getting back in the mix with Snoop. Buckham, track 2 was Dr. Dre. Just Dipping towards the end of the album was Dr. Dre. And Be Please, that became the popular single featuring Exhibit, Nate Dogg. Eminem, like a year or 2 later, did a remix on it on the Marshall Mathers LP. They called it Be Please 2. So Dr. Dre and Snoop finally linked back up a little bit for a couple tracks on this one. By the way, KLC of Beats by the Pound did produce 2 tracks from here. It was this a redo on the Juice Crew's The Symphony, where it's kind of like a posse cut. Different members of No Limit featured on that one. And then the anthem, Down for My Ends. That was that's a song that's grown in popularity over the years. Down for My Ends. That's the F for mother, cause I'm down for my, right? It was a C Murder song, actually. Like, it was on C Murder's Trapped in Crime album, as well as No Limit Top Dog. So yeah, when KLC did perform, or rather produce, he came up with the big one right there. But I liked No Limit Top Dog a lot more than The Game Is To Be Sold, Not To Be Told, because No Limit Top Dog sounded like a Snoop album. And then you get to The Last Meal. That was Snoop's last album on No Limit, and I think that was Snoop's best album from No Limit. This was the closest I think we had gotten to vintage Snoop since Doggystyle, and Dr. Dre produced 4 tracks from The Last Meal. By the way, Scott Storch produced a couple tracks, but those were heaters. The last song of the album, Y'all Gon' Miss Me, or rather, Scott Storch actually produced 3 tracks. It was Y'all Gon' Miss Me, it was Brake Fluid or Pump Your Brakes, and then Ready to Ride. So Scott Storch actually had a few really good tracks from here, but Dr. Dre produced 4 beats on this album, including Lay Low. That was one of the singles from this album. You had a few beats from Meech Wells, you had Battle Cat, Carlos Stevens, but yeah, Dr. Dre, like on No Limit Top Dog, produced a few songs from The Last Meal. Again, I think that this was Snoop's best on No Limit, but not only that, I think this might have been Snoop's second best album in his entire discography. I like The Last Meal that much. And then he leaves No Limit, he releases Paid the Cost to Be the Boss. That's the album with Beautiful. It's the album with From the Church to the Palace. Dr. Dre didn't produce anything from this album, nothing from Snoop's next album. That was R&G, Rhythm and Gangsta, the masterpiece. That was the album with Drop It Like It's Hot. So at this point, you've got Snoop working with the Neptunes and Pharrell a lot more. Dr. Dre didn't produce anything from there, or like I said, the predecessor, Paid the Cost to Be the Boss. Dre did produce a couple beats on the following album, The Blue Carpet Treatment. But after that, you would be hard pressed to find a lot of production on Snoop Dogg albums from basically Ego Trippin' on. So there was Ego Trippin', Malice in Wonderland, and a few albums after that. Dre might have produced one song in that whole mix, but most of Snoop's discography from that point is absent of Dr. Dre production. And quite frankly, after, I would say, the album after the Blue Carpet Treatment, Ego Trippin', which I like that album a lot too. That was released in 2008. That one hit number 3 on the Billboard 200 albums chart. And I feel like after that, the appetite or the interest, enthusiasm for Snoop albums per release reduced album after album after album, which is normal. I mean, that's totally natural for an artist to have a peak. And if you, I mean, consider it, Snoop had a pretty long peak. I mean, he had Doggystyle, The Dogfather, The Game Is To Be Sold, No Limit Top Dog, The Last Meal, Paid the Cost to Be the Boss, RNG, Rhythm and Gangsta, The Blue Carpet Treatment, and Ego Trippin'. You could argue, even though, I mean, the debut, Doggystyle, was by far his greatest album, right? But he had a pretty long prime. If that is the end of his prime, Ego Trippin', that's going from 93 to 2008. Not to say that Snoop was just like creating a bunch of hits during that whole period, but every couple of years, Snoop Dogg would have another hit. Like on Ego Trippin', I think that was the one with Sexual Eruption. I think on the radio they called it Sexual Seduction, but that was a hit. And again, that was 15 years after Doggystyle. But after that, you know, number 3, number 8, number 16, I'm listing the peak on Billboard for these albums. Reincarnated, that's when he came out as Snoop Lion. That one peaked at number 16. Bush in 2015 peaked at 14. Kool-Aid peaked at 40. Never Left, that which even uses a photo of like 19, 18-year-old Snoop. That peaked at number 54. Bible of Love peaked at 148. I Wanna Thank Me, 76. From the Streets to the Suites didn't even chart. And then Back on Death Row, after he bought Death Row in 2022, peaked at 104. Didn't even crack the top 100. So yeah, enthusiasm for Snoop albums, like in any artist's life cycle, has just gone down over time. And the only other real place that you could find a lot of Dre production with Snoop rapping was on Dr. Dre 2001 on like The Next Episode, Still DRE, you know, the different songs from that. You know, you could call that one a classic. Yeah, The Chronic One was a classic. Dr. Dre 2001 was like it felt like a greatest hits album, like in terms of how those songs have aged over time. But that was the other instance where you got Dre production, Snoop rhyming. And on this new album that's coming out in November, Missionary, again, this is a Dr. Dre produced Snoop album. I'm hearing that Dre isn't rapping a lot on this album. So it's not gonna be like The Chronic One or Dr. Dre 2001, where Dre is like one of the most prominent voices on the album. He's gonna be featured maybe on 1 or 2 tracks, as he said in an interview with, I think, Entertainment Tonight or something. But this is gonna be much more like Doggystyle, where you've got Snoop doing the bulk of the rapping, and there's gonna be a lot of features. I hear Sting is gonna be on the album. You're probably gonna get some of the usual suspects like Corrupt. Obviously, Nate Dogg passed away several years ago, so they would have to unearth an unreleased vocal from Nate Dogg for him to be featured on the album. But this isn't gonna be like a co-rapping album between Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, where they're just trading verses like they did on Nothing But a G Thing and certain other tracks. This is gonna be Snoop Dogg as the primary vocalist, Dr. Dre as the producer. So why are they doing this? I mean, I know Snoop Dogg was just featured heavily in the Olympics, but they've been working on this one since 2022. So why is now the time to have a Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre album? And is this album gonna actually do well? Are people gonna care more about this album than they've cared about Snoop Dogg's last 5 to 8 albums? Well, here's what I will guess about this album. I think that this is gonna be his highest charting album since 2008's Ego Trippin'. That hit number 3. I think this is gonna chart higher than Documentary from 2011 that hit number 8, Malice in Wonderland, and obviously a lot of the albums that hit in the 30s, 40s, and below. I think that this, because you've got Dr. Dre, who's one of the more reclusive legends in the game. Like, he did produce and perform on that Compton soundtrack, but we never got like the Detox album, right? That was Dr. Dre's long anticipated 3rd album, which never dropped. And Dre is very selective on when he puts stuff out. He doesn't even do like a ton of production on a ton of different projects. Like, he's very economical in what he actually releases. So Dre basically being fully involved in this Snoop Dogg album is gonna do enough, in my opinion, to generate great interest. So I think that Ego Trippin' hit number 3. I think that this will make the top 10. I don't know if it's gonna crack top 3. It might surprise us all and hit number 1, which would be something that Snoop hasn't done since his first album on No Limit. Like, Snoop's first 3 albums hit number 1, and after that he never hit number 1 again. And when I hear commentary around the album from like Eric Sermon, who says he's got a crazy song on the album, the DOC, the person who was supposed to be up next in the early 90s before his devastating car accident ruined his voice and his career was just cut short, he said that this album, this Missionary album, is gonna sound like what Snoop's next Death Row album would have sounded like if he didn't leave Death Row, which, I mean, you've got to consider a lot. Like, Dre was gone, so are we talking, I'm assuming he's saying if Dre stayed with Death Row and if Dre produced another Snoop Dogg album in the mid 90s on Death Row, that this is what it's supposed to sound like. To which I'll say, like, it can't be that. You can't just rewind the clock and what is the production gonna sound like it's pulled straight out of 1994, 1996? I can't imagine that being the case. I mean, even Dr. Dre 2001, yes, it did have some G-Funk-ish sounds in it, but it sounded like a late 90s, early 2000s version of Dr. Dre. And if you listen to Dr. Dre's The Compton soundtrack, which Dre didn't produce most of that soundtrack, so you know, you can't really glean too much from that. But I don't think that they're just gonna rewind the clock like 30 years and create an album that sounds like 30 years ago. Like, when you hear Snoop talk about it, he says that this is like a mature Snoop Dogg, and he's allowing Dre and excited about Dre fully producing him. Basically, Dre using Snoop like a robot, essentially using his voice as an instrument, so Dre's musical mastery could be put into work with Snoop basically being the vessel, the conduit, the channel. Which, I mean, that's about as much as you could hope for with a 2024 album with Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre. So I'm gonna sit back, I'm gonna listen to what the eventual first single is gonna be, and then I'll kind of either raise my expectations or temper my expectations based on what I hear there. But I've gotta say, for a Snoop Dogg album, I am pretty damn excited about this one. I mean, it's interesting because Snoop Dogg is arguably the most famous rapper in the world. If you think about it, like, I know Eminem is, you know, the biggest selling rapper of all time, and you've got different artists who you could argue, I mean, you've got stars who have emerged since Snoop Dogg's prime, right? You've got Drake, Kanye West, Jay-Z, Biggie and Tupac. They were about as big as it gets from the mid 90s onward. So you've got different iconic rappers. LL Cool J is one of the first rap superstars, along with Rev Run from Run DMC, Curtis Blow. But what I'm saying is, in terms of fame that comes with the rapper, Lil Wayne, you name it, you've got famous rappers. I don't know if you could find another rapper who you could drop them in any part of the world and more people are gonna recognize them than Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg is like a walking brand. And so, given that, no artist is immune from people losing interest in their music project over project. I mean, this is gonna be Snoop's 20th album. The guy's put in a lot of work, but when you have that collaboration with Dr. Dre, there's like a romanticizing of Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre as a tandem, even though, again, as I just went over, it's actually somewhat limited output that they've had together over the years. But in our minds, we still view it in a certain way. It's almost like how people view Mike Tyson. He's gonna be fighting Jake Paul. I don't think he's got any business fighting Jake Paul. I've got a boxing channel, so you could hear my reasons as to why, but people almost suspend belief when it comes to Mike Tyson, even in his late 50s. I think that there's gonna be a certain level of people suspending belief and believing that they're gonna be able to create some magic when you get Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg together, even if it is 2024. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this one. I was surprised to see that they are actually working on I mean, what do you want to call it, a follow-up to Doggystyle in Missionary? But they are working on this album together. Again, it's going to be on Death Row, Aftermath, Interscope. We've got Dr. Dre producing a Snoop Dogg album for the first time since Doggystyle in 1993. Let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. Do you have high expectations? Do you think the public is gonna care about this one? Is this one gonna have commercial success? I mean, look, these guys are so famous that when I went to Coachella in 2012, it was Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg headlining on Sunday. Eminem showed up. He performed with them. That's the one where they brought the Tupac hologram out. But the headliner, it said Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. It wasn't just Snoop Dogg. It wasn't just Dr. Dre. It was Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. Together, I feel like that brand is huge. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they recently came out with what, like a gin and juice or some product together. So it only makes sense. I'm surprised that they haven't done more collaborative branding over the past couple decades, but maybe the time in 2024 is right. Let me know your thoughts on this upcoming Missionary album. What are your expectations here? Let me know your thoughts. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love hip hop like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.